1370 AM, 96.3 FM, The Source.
Thank you for tuning in. I often wonder if the news media is reflecting the real world we live in. When you see stories that indicate or seem to imply that America is becoming more and more divided by a racial divide, I hold that up against the world I live in, and maybe I live in a different kind of a world. I don't know, radio, showbiz in general, art. Maybe that world is a little isolated from factories and blue collar workers, etc. Maybe it is. I don't know. I remember as a kid, though. I remember when I'd say I grew up north, but still I wasn't uninformed about what was going on in the country in the '60s with the black and the white. And then this show came out called Hair, and of course I wasn't allowed to see it. There was some naked people on stage apparently. but we knew the story, and we knew the story also had to deal with the black and the white. And I went and got the soundtrack, and the soundtrack clearly was expressing some of those things in the songs. And back in those days, after Kennedy got shot, Lyndon Johnson was the president, and next thing you know, he was creating some rules and some commissions to study all of this. Let's find out a little bit about this, because that's as much as I can tell you, kids. I don't know a whole lot more, but our guest knows a whole lot more. He's got a book called Separate and Unequal. Let me introduce to you Steve M. Gillon. He's a resident historian for the History Channel. He's a professor of history at the University of Oklahoma, and the commission, I believe, is the Kerner Commission. I think so, the one I was referring to. Separate and Unequal. It's an honor to have you on the show, Stephen M. Gillon. Good morning, sir.
Thanks, Larry. Nice to be with you.
Yeah. Was this something that you wrote in order to figure something out? Like, was it bothering you? What did this really change America or make it worse?
Well, what inspired me was I was actually watching the riots in Ferguson. And I grew up in a working-class neighborhood outside Philadelphia. There were riots in the 60s, and I wanted to figure out why they were occurring then and why they're still occurring now, and that's why I wrote the book.
And do you think that that's the way the media, does the news media reflect the real world, or do they focus on the wrong thing and make us believe it, and does that actually make it real after a while?
That's a really good question and a complicated one. Here's where I came away from all this is that it's impossible to ignore the tremendous progress that's been made over the past 50 years since the Kerner Commission came out. I mean, there is now a large and thriving African-American middle class. African-Americans are still underrepresented, but better represented in the professions. There's been a softening of racial attitudes. We've had an African-American president. But I do believe that for those who are left behind in these decaying urban centers, that they are more segregated than they were 50 years ago, and they're more cut off from the mainstream of American society. So it's kind of it's a split message.
Is it because that they have lost their drive and they feel they're entitled?
No, absolutely not. What has happened over the past 50 years is there's been a dramatic flight of jobs and the middle class to the suburbs. In many of those suburban areas, African Americans were prevented from moving because of discrimination. So I don't think it's a lack of motivation. They have been trapped in this urban core. They have been largely prevented from moving to the suburbs. And when they move to the suburbs, it's usually a suburb that is either has a large black population or is predominantly black. Mm-hmm. And they have no means of transportation to get to the suburbs. The schools in the urban areas are awful. I mean, every aspect of American life is impacted. They can't get decent food and vegetables. They have poor schooling. So all the institutions in these areas fail to serve the people who live there.
And why is that? I mean, how is that even happening?
It's been happening for a long time. There were, in my lifetime, and Larry, since you were talking about being alive in the 60s and remember some of these events, in your lifetime as well, African Americans were unable to vote in the South. They could not, they had to drink from separate facilities. And while we focus on the South, in the North, there was just as much discrimination. It was just not enforced by law.
Right.
It was enforced by practices. I mean, if you belonged to a union, it was almost impossible for an African American to become a member of a union because these were jobs that went passed down from father to son, and they were always white.
See, I didn't know that. I didn't know that.
Yes.
Where are you calling from? Just curious.
I'm actually, I live in Miami, but I am in New York City right now.
Okay, so I grew up on Long Island, outside of New York City, and I don't know if you know the town of Merrick.
Sure, of course.
One train stop to the west, as you go toward the city, is Freeport. And the reason I bring up that city I grew up in and the one next door is because my town was almost all white. Freeport was almost all black, but they had a better movie theater, so I used to go over there for the movies. But since I moved in Florida, I'm in Florida now, and when I was doing an interview one day with one of the guys who lives here, I'm also a musician, and this guy was in here because he was promoting his music, and he was a black guy, and he plays the bass guitar, and I'm saying, well, where are you from? And he said, from Freeport. Next, the town over, not the island in the Caribbean. And
they bonded.
And I said, isn't that crazy? And I said, isn't it crazy that Freeport was all black and Merrick was all white? He said, it still is. It's to this day. So, is that by choice? Or is that somehow real estate agents got together and said, well, here's what we'll do?
Well, I'll give you an example. There was a number of studies done, where they would take a couple, an African-American couple and a white couple, create an identical profile, same financials, everything else, and they would send them out to look at houses, and the realtors would inevitably bring the black family to a black area and the white family to a white area. And they would also, and then the banks would oftentimes reject the black application for a mortgage and accept the white application. So these practices still exist. I grew up like you.
Yeah.
I'm a product of white flight. I grew up in an all-white neighborhood, white schools, white everything, and there was a African-American school, a 99% African-American school that was about 100 yards from my house.
Yeah. Do you know what? I don't know if this is a crazy thought, but I've had a thought on how to, and I've observed this too, that the same things you're articulating in the book researched. And by the way, this is an unbelievably researched book. But I've thought about this, and this is crazy, because if I go to a church here in Ocala, it's usually one race or the other. There's a few black people in my mom's church, and I don't know if they feel uncomfortable or not. They don't seem to feel uncomfortable. But if you go to a black church, it's usually all black. So I thought, why don't we just suggest, hey, on Sunday morning, go to a church that's not your color. Just see what happens. Mm-hmm. See if we can maybe start. And not that it's going to be law. Nobody's mandating it, but just try to break that whole thing that's been happening. Larry,
that's one of the best ideas I've heard in a long time.
I don't know.
You should. I think it's a wonderful idea, and you're right. I think we need to find spaces where blacks and whites can interact and get to know each other, and that's where racism starts disappearing. And the problem is that whites have been black and blacks have been pitted against each other.
Well, I just want to tell all the black people, the white church has the better potato salad. That's the really... I'm not trying to start an argument here. I'm just telling you.
Oh, that's so racist of you to say that.
You have done an amazing amount of research for the book. Stephen, thank you. I really think this is something we need to look at and try to figure out what we can do to fix it, because I don't think my world reflects what the news shows, and I don't want the news changing my world so that it does look like the news. And God forbid it does. So hopefully your book will open our eyes and get us to realize what we need to be doing differently. Little by little.
So.
Hopefully we get better.
Yeah.
I know you got to go separate and unequal. Stephen M. Gillon, I found your book on Amazon, and that's where you can get. Do you want to mention a website real quick?
I don't have a website.
Okay, all right. Stephen, thank you for being on the show with us today.
Thank you, Larry. I really appreciate it.
All right, we will take a break, and we'll be right back. This is WOCA.
Life South encourages you to share the love this winter by sharing life through blood donation. The winter season is always a difficult time to collect enough blood to keep local hospitals stocked. So embrace the giving spirit and give the greatest gift of all this year. Give life. Your blood donation could help